Now, you're back in the House of Mystery, and today we're going to be talking about Ed Gein. And joining us is writer, filmmaker John Borowski, and his new book, The Ed Gein File, A Psycho's Confession and Case Documents. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's our honor. So now, back to true crime again. What made you pick Ed Gein?
I've always been fascinated by Ed Gein's story. You know, his is one where I've always wanted to tell it in film form, but as a feature film rather than a documentary. There have been some documentaries on television and the internet about Ed Gein, so in my mind, and in my lifetime, I would still love to do a feature film on Ed Gein, because I feel that the three that have been made on his life haven't really captured the essence of who he was and the crimes that he committed, as well as his downfall into insanity and just his character in general, and the ghoulish nature of his crimes. You know, and of course, my favorite film is Psycho. So when I was younger and I learned that it was loosely based on Ed Gein's story, that, you know, even made me more fascinated in Ed Gein. You know, there were the three films that they've made. There was one called Deranged, which was one of the first ones that they had made about him, and that one's not too bad. If anyone wants to see a film on Ed Gein, I'd kind of recommend that one, because it's kind of the best of all the ones that have been made so far. But again, ideally, I'd love to make, you know, a feature film on him sometime in the future. So I thought, okay, you know, I had come across his case files and had never seen them in print before. There have been some books on Ed Gein. Harold Schechter wrote a book, and then there was one called Psycho. And they were very informative, but I like to publish these books with the true case files or period piece books to give people a better idea of what it was like, or you're hearing it from the actual serial killer's mouth, you know. And now Ed Gein supposedly only killed 2 people, and the old definition of a serial killer, he wouldn't fall into that because it's at least 3 or more, but now they've kind of changed, they're changing that definition of serial killer to, you know, possibly killing 2 people with the intention of killing more. And, you know, obviously, you know, that Ed Gein's last victim, Worden, the way he had her, you know, trussed up like a deer in his barn, you could kind of see him going that route, you know, and continuing.
So what was the story with Ed Gein, for the people that don't know, because this was a while ago? This was back in, 1957?
Yes, yeah, he was apprehended in 57. So what it was, Ed Gein grew up on a little farm, which his family had moved to after another location, but he had grown up in Plainfield, and in the secluded, you know, kind of country area in Plainfield, a very small town, Plainfield, Wisconsin. And as he was growing up, he had an older brother, a mother, and a father. Eventually, his older brother died in a very strange accident, and I personally think that Gein probably killed him, because Gein was very close with his mother. He had a very tight relationship with her. She was very religious. She would tell him things like, you can't have intercourse outside of marriage, and most women are whores, and, you know, so he would go back and forth with these thoughts in his head. They say it's because of his mother, and when you read the book, you see, you know, his feelings for his mother, and sometimes he would break down crying during the interrogation as well. So then his brother died, his father wound up passing away, and his mother had a stroke or two, several strokes, and he wound up caring for her on this little farmhouse in Plainfield. So eventually she passed away. And after she passed away, that's when, you know, his mental state really degraded over time, and he slowly went insane. He closed off the entire house other than several rooms which he lived in. No heat, no electricity, on the secluded farm. He would start hearing his mother's voice in his head, and so what he would do is to, entertain himself and to supposedly, relive his mother being in the house, is he would go to local graves and dig up bodies. And he learned taxidermy. He would, it's hard to say what he exactly did, because what they found later when investigators went into the house were, pieces of human skin. He would replace chairs. He would stretch skin over chairs. He would make drums of human skin. He would pull the skin off of skulls, and these were all females. And he would hang the headpieces around his house. He would make soup bowls out of skulls. He would saw those open. They found like leggings made from women's flesh that he would wear. Supposedly he would dance in the moonlight while he was wearing these pieces of women's skin either on his face. They said he was somewhat feminine, so it isn't sure if he was trying to become a woman, if he wanted to become a woman, or just become the embodiment of his mother. It was very strange psychologically. So eventually he wound up killing a woman, a bar owner in Wisconsin, and she disappeared. No one ever knew what happened to her. They didn't pin that on Ed Gein until the second murder. It was the owner of a hardware store, Mrs. Worden, and Gein went in there and took a gun off the wall and shot her in the back of the head and took her body home with him. And that's how they traced it back to Ed, because, some people had seen his truck at the hardware store, and then when they go to his house and they look in the barn, here's her body, Mrs. Worden, trussed up like a deer, basically. Her head was decapitated off the body. The insides were cleaned out. She was hung upside down. And, that probably plays into Gein's seeing all the hunting that was going on in Wisconsin as well, and how they would truss up deers. But who knows, his intentions were possibly to wear that as a skin suit. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that's where that kind of comes into play, because that was loosely based on his story as well as parts of Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. So he was kind of like a ghoul. He would dig up graves, and later they went to several grave yards in Plainfield, Spirit Land and Plainfield Cemetery, and they exhumed these graves and found the bodies were either gone or messed with by Ed Gein. So it was definitely, and he was this meek, kind of quiet guy. No one knew what he was doing. Some people in the town would let him babysit some of the kids. So that's what I had a problem with. One of the films, they made him seem like people were a little hesitant or thought he was strange, but nobody did. They just thought he was quiet, a little old Eddie that lived in the town, And again, I think a ghoul is probably the best term that comes to mind when you're describing Ed Gein, because the things he did were things that he would read about in these detective magazines of human headhunters in the jungle, or cannibals in the jungle, or he was just exhumed by these stories, and that's eventually what he wanted to do. He wanted to bring those stories to life.
So now, was he like a working man? Did he have a job? Did he have family of his own? Was he married?
No, he was single. I think he went out on one date with a woman in the town, and she came forward later to describe that he was nice to her. There was no problem. And he just worked on that farm. He owned the farm, and that was it. He had no other job that I know of. So, he owned the farm and lived on it, and that was it. I don't know, what type of income was coming in for him, but that was all he did. Now, there was a teenager that was babysitting at some point. I think it was either before the two murders or between them, and she disappeared. So some people think that he may have taken her too, but nothing was found later. It was very strange, I don't think there's ever been an incident where I've seen someone apprehended and there's no mugshot. They didn't take a mugshot of him. There were photographers that, at the scene at his house and after that had taken pictures, but there was no mug shot. It took years just to go to trial. I think it was about 5 years just to go to trial. It was very strange. I think, obviously, the town of Plainfield and Wisconsin, were embarrassed by this. But, eventually, Gein just wound up in a psychiatric hospital in Wisconsin, Mendota, and that's where he lived out his life. So, imagine, I spoke with John Wayne Gacy's psychiatrist, Helen Morrison. She used to work at Mendota, and she told me the story about when she was working there, she asked, well, who's this old man staring out the window? And that's, he was just this unassuming little old man that would wear women's skin and create, furniture from skin and, dig up bodies and murder people. And it's just a strange ending for this, serial killer that's known throughout the world now. I mean, there were album covers made from him, T-shirts, and, he's just become like this kind of folk, creature, monster in U.S. history. But it was a true story, and he actually existed.
So what do you think the fascination with him is? Just that he was taking the body parts and the skin and the lips and then all that stuff and doing things with it?
Yeah, I think, there were several aspects. One, that he was this unassuming guy that lived on this farm in Wisconsin and kind of the middle of nowhere in this country town. And, no one realized what was going on. And I think it was really the ghoulish things that he did. How, you rarely hear of somebody making furniture of human skin and belts out of nipples and, vests of skin. And, he would keep hearts and, various parts of the female anatomy in his house. And, I think, people, again, when we hear these stories, people wonder why. Why do people do these things? But he slowly went insane over a period of years after his mother's death. They found one coffee can filled with chewed bubble gum. Like, he would chew gum and he would just put it in this can. They found a whole can filled with that. They found, a box filled with women's dentures and all these strange things that he was collecting. And like I said, he basically lived in these 2 rooms. So when the story broke at that time, wow, he had 10 female heads in his house, and he made furniture from women's skin, and he would dig up bodies, and it was so ghoulish. It was like something out of, a Universal horror film, or, the story of grave diggers and grave robbers. But, he didn't do it for profit. He just did it for his own pleasure.
Huh. And now, was he eating body parts as well, or was it just all for dress?
Yeah, that's what's unknown. When they did, supposedly when they found the last body in his barn, they had also found on his stove a heart in a pan. So was he going to eat that? What was he going to do with that? Who knows? So he may have been a cannibal. When you read the book that I published, he denies a lot of things, but then he kind of backtracks and, mentions, what he would do with them. So, he never really actually admitted being a cannibal, but they found, pieces, of heart and liver and things either in the fridge or on his stove. So they thought, okay, well, maybe he did do these things. Because, when we hear about these serial killers, sometimes it's the serial killer that tries to up others, whether it's body count or, just in terms of being more disgusting than others have been, whether it's cannibalism or vampirism. But Gein wasn't like that. So the press, I think at first, as always, they probably swung it, wow, he's most likely a cannibal, and he's a grave digger, and he's a ghoul, and, all these things. So, it's been said that he may have been a cannibal, but it's very hard to prove that.
So with the 2 that we know that he killed, was he doing the same thing? I'm just trying to picture, like he was he was going to graveyards and taking bodies out and using the parts for, lampshades and bowls. Why did he choose a couple of live victims?
Well, and here's the thing too. The first female victim, who was the bar owner, when he had went to the bar, and of course it's a small town, So, he had known about her, and he would go to this bar sometimes and have a drink or a beer or whatever, and he was attracted to her. So that's kind of what Robert Bloch used to influence Psycho, where Ed Gein would have these feelings of attraction to women, but then, he would hear his mother's voice saying, all women are whores, if you're not married to them, it's not right, there's no such thing, of intercourse before marriage. So he would have these feelings inside him, and then when he would hear his mother's voice, or think of what his mother said about them, then there would be this rage and hatred that would fill him inside. So I think he was attracted to both of these women, but then, when he would hear his mother's voice, that was, kind of his way of saying, all right, well, I'm going to take them off the face of the earth because of what they did. There's even, I don't want to tell too much about Worden, the last victim, but there's interesting things that Gein says in the book that I published that I had never even knew before, of his reasons why. And it usually has to do with, biblical versus infidelity, intercourse outside of marriage, things like that his mother supposedly hammered into his head so that he had these thoughts. And that's supposedly the impetus behind him killing these women. There was an attraction and then a revulsion that caused him to kill them.
How do you think he lured them back to his ranch?
Well, the first victim, after the bar closed, he shot her in the bar. And he had a truck, so he would just put the body in the back of his truck. And then the second victim, he shot her in the hardware store, put her in the back of his truck, drove like halfway home, and then supposedly went back home and got a car and transferred her to the car because they found the truck with the blood on the back of it. And that's another reason, a piece of evidence that they tied into Gein. So that's what it was. Obviously he wasn't charismatic. He wasn't like an H.H. Holmes. He was just this quiet, shy, country guy. So, he didn't have the prowess to lure these women back to his place. His two victims, he shot them and threw them in a truck or car and took them back to his place and worked on their bodies. I believe they did find the head of the first victim on his farm as well. But, for them too, who knows what he did? Maybe they were, he, after a certain point of taxidermizing or working on the flesh from women from the graves, maybe he wanted fresh victims so that, he could even try them on. That's why I think he would have continued forward, because he had only, killed two women only, but still.
Yeah. And so now he eventually got caught. And what happened to him in the trial?
Well, there wasn't really much. He was quiet. It was, I believe, it was a fairly quick trial. There was a lot of secrecy. They didn't go to trial until 4 or 5 years after he was arrested. It was very, very unusual. I think just the trial and that whole process could be studied. So it was highly unusual that it took so long. But then eventually, when they went to trial, they just found him. There was nothing strange or unusual about the trial. Everybody agreed, because, again, when you read my book that I just published, the Ed Gein File, there are psychiatric testimonies, and they all say, well, he's clearly insane. And that's when they decided, okay, well, let's just send him to Mendota Psychiatric Hospital in Wisconsin.
Wow. So, and what ended up happening to him?
That was it. He lives out his entire life, as an elderly man at Mendota. There was a time in the 70s that he tried to appeal to either be set free or sent to another psychiatric hospital, but that was declined by the judge, obviously. But and that's what I think the strangest thing is. Now, this book, supposedly, what you'll learn supposedly is that his interrogation was recorded on reel-to-reel, the old-time reel-to-reel tapes. And it does say in my book from the files that I discovered, they say that those are lost. So, I don't know if they're gone, if they still exist. It would be interesting to hear his actual voice, but they may be gone forever. But what they did was someone had transcribed all of those reel-to-reels for the case file, and those are the files that are in the book that I published.
Yeah, it looks really, really interesting. You've got the, it says for the first time in print, you've got his full confession and the official case documents. How did you get a hold of those?
Those were all from Wisconsin. It was all from the Wisconsin clerk's office. I contacted them, and through some research and talking to the right people, they made sure that, they could get me the documents. And, it took some time to find. I had hoped that, and they also had some photographs, such as Worden's body hanging in his barn, some pieces of evidence like a cup that was found at the hardware store with his bloody fingerprint on it, a couple shots of his farm. So they included those as well. It would have been nice if there were some photographs of the actual evidence that they took. Those are what I'd really like to see, because I would have thought that after they collected all this evidence, they took photos of the heads and, body parts and all these things, but those are either locked down somewhere, and that would take even more research, or they're destroyed or missing. Who knows? But I would have thought they would have taken photos of those things. But who knows? They didn't even take his mugshot, so maybe they didn't even take photos of those things. But the book is his confession, the autopsy of Bernice Worden's body. It also includes the psychiatric statements, his fingerprint chart, his identification chart, his birth and death certificates, his physical report too, all about how he came in, and basically a description of his entire body, a little bit more than is necessary. So I decided, like my other two books, these should be available for people, researchers, to read, because again, there are times where, I feel like writing a book, but there have been other books written with either other people's opinions or actual writings. That's why I thought, okay, these are actual case documents. So in this book, I didn't write anything. I compiled it, and Stephen Giannangelo wrote the foreword. He wrote a phenomenal book called Real Life Monsters. He's a forensic psychiatrist, and he wrote the foreword. And it's like a must-have for all true crime fans, I think.
What did you learn from his confession? Anything different?
There were a lot of details. There were a lot of details that I never knew before. Such as his reasoning supposedly behind, and I say supposedly a lot because with, these serial killers, many of them lying, it's hard to tell when they're actually telling you the truth. But supposedly his reasons for killing his last victim, those are in there. But, there's a lot of denial on his part, or kind of like, I don't remember, it could have been, maybe it happened, But then finally, when it gets, throughout his interrogation and his confession, there are details, but then finally at the end, he does admit what he did.
Oh, so he actually really admits to killing them,
yeah.
But he's trying to justify himself is what he's doing.
Yeah, I think so. And then, they asked him, well, why did you, wait so long to tell us? And he said, I just wanted to see how long this would go on. So he was just enjoying himself. I think he didn't have anything else to do. There are definitely interesting things as you're reading it. Even the psychiatric testimonies, they give little sound bites that Gein had said to them. And even those are fascinating outside of the interrogation because, they're, again, you have to look at it as a whole. And I just think it's fascinating, just like the Albert Fish book that I published prior to this one, with his writings and psychiatric testimonies and some trial transcripts. I think it's amazing that these books, you could read them as if you were at the trial, or you were at the interrogation, or you were there at that time period, rather than like I said, an author writing looking back.
Well, and now Albert Fish was he was the child killer, wasn't he, and cannibal? Yeah,
he was a child killer and cannibal in New York City, basically in the 1920s, during the Depression. He was the original stranger danger, so he would offer children candy, lure them away, and wind up strangling them and eating them. He's most famous for sending a letter to the little girl, Grace Budd, her mother, 6 years after he killed her. He sent a letter to the mother describing where he took her, what he did to her, how he cooked her, how he cut up her body, and, how he put her in the stew and in the oven, and, I think he was the worst, in my opinion, Albert Fish, because he basically did anything and everything you could think of. They had to create at the time, what they call perversions. They had to create new perversions just for him that weren't even on the books.
Wow. And those times back then, you're saying in the 20s, so they didn't really, people weren't in a general thought of keeping your kids safe from strangers and things like that.
No, especially at that time period. You see some of the stock footage. These kids are playing on the streets. Their parents might have even been at work, maybe not even home. There was a story of a little boy named Billy Gaffney that was playing in a hallway of his tenement building, and I found that actual tenement. It's still there, and I filmed it for the documentary that I did on Albert Fish. And, he disappeared, and when the parents came out and talked to the other little boy that he was playing with, he pointed to the fire escape going to the roof. He pointed up there and said the boogeyman took him. So, even then, he was kind of the original boogeyman, the original stranger danger, and just a frightening case. But he looked like an innocent old man, like he could have been anybody's grandfather. But what was most also interesting about Albert Fish is not only he liked to hear the screams and cries of children. That was his pleasure. But he would punish himself for doing these things, too. So he had a religious complex. He would whip himself bloody, and he had a paddle that he would nail nails into and beat himself with that. His son actually saw him beating himself with that one time. So, he thought he would see Jesus and angels, and, he was definitely, but in Fish's case, they found him sane because they wanted to execute him.
Well, and in that case, too, you actually have his confessions in your book as well, don't you?
Yes. There were many confessions in the book at Albert Fish in his own words, and there were many things that he confessed to in that book that he wrote to the psychiatrist, Dr. Frederick Wortham, that we've never seen before, because those files were only opened 6 years ago. So Dr. Wortham, the psychiatrist, who was the one behind the, I don't know if you remember all the EC comics, he was the one that railroaded against those, like the Vault of Horror and Tales from the Crypt, and said, that they're polluting children's minds. So he wanted all those files for Albert Fish for some reason locked until 2010. And so when they were opened, I had the ability to, gain access to them at the Library of Congress and review them and, put them in the book.
So now, his story now, he was basically a child molester as well, wasn't he? Like, what was his story?
Yeah, that was his main thing. Supposedly, now, Albert Fish, most serial killers start early in life, whether it's their teens or their early 20s. But Albert Fish was unique because he started later. He probably didn't start until late 30s, early 40s, because his wife had left him. He was married and he had children, but he would place ads in newspapers asking women, trying to find, because that's what they would do at that time period, try and find women who were into S&M. So when his wife found out about this, she eventually left him and took the children. And the children grew up and had grandchildren because, his daughter stated that he never harmed or spoke a bad word, never swore in front of the grandchildren, never hurt them at all. But here he is, kidnapping and killing and raping little children. But yeah, he was pretty much a pedophile, and so he said after his wife left, that's when everything happened, because the doors were open, he could do whatever he wanted. So not only would he place these ads in newspapers asking women to do disgusting things with him, he would drink urine and eat feces, all these, just disgusting things. And, his main thing, the pleasure, was to get off on the screaming of these children. He would find them, kidnap them, and torture them, and he would, put a gag in their mouth, and he would get off on them screaming and that, crying, and that was basically, his perversion.
Wow. And so, and what was the, he was actually, cutting them up, or what was he doing to their bodies?
Yeah, there's they're not. It's not known how many victims he had. We know for sure Grace Budd because he confessed to that one, the little girl that he killed and cannibalized. But we don't know how many. He was a house painter, so he would travel all across the United States, going from state to state, painting these houses, and he had empty houses available to him. So he would kidnap these children and rape them, maybe let them go, and they wouldn't say anything, or some he would kill. But what he did with Grace Budd is, he said after he killed her, he left her head in an outhouse that was near the house, and her body, but he would cut parts of her flesh off. He said the ass was the sweetest part of the body, so that's what he would like. So he said he baked her ass in the oven with strips of bacon on it, and the rest he made a stew out of with, and he described, carrots and, potatoes, what he would put in the stew. So, when I created my film, it's interesting, when you're watching the visuals, if you turn the sound off, it's just an old man making soup and stew. But, it's really when you turn the sound on, that's what makes people, there were people that walked out on the movie, and my comment was, well, I succeeded in what I wanted to do, and that was the point. I mean, I don't want people to walk out, but if I succeeded in pushing it to a point where it's, so vile, like Albert Fish himself, that's kind of the point of the film. But again, it wasn't that graphic, but when you combine, his words, and I had an excellent actor, reading his words, so when you combine that with the visuals, for some people it's just too much to take, and the fact that it's children.
Right. Now, he was also into self-harm of some sort, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. Just like the Flagellants, who were a religious sect, that would whip themselves, and that's what he would do. He would whip himself bloody, beat himself with his bloody paddles, and he would take rose stems with the thorns on them, insert them into his penis. Because when people are into S&M, you have to continually top the last pain, and that's how Fish was. He would take alcohol-soaked cotton balls, stick them in his anus, and light them. He would stick needles under his fingernails. So eventually, when they apprehended him, they wound up tracing the letter that he wrote to the mother of Grace Budd. They wound up tracing it, and they wound up catching him, apprehending him. Well, he told the authorities, I punished myself as penance for killing these children. Well, they didn't believe him. So they took him to the hospital, and they took him an X-ray of his abdomen, which is in the book, and on this X-ray, you could see his bones, and you could see 29 needles that he stuck up into his perineum that somehow stayed in his body forever and didn't hit any major internal organs. Some were like 3 inches long. You could see the eyes of the needles inside him. And the big myth, the big, kind of urban legend is that he shorted out the electric chair because he was the oldest man ever executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. So, he was tried and, found guilty, and, his penance was, death by electric chair. But that theory that the electric chair shorted out, I found the book of his executioner, and in the book, the executioner writes that nothing unusual happened. He was gone in a couple minutes. It only took a couple minutes. So people sometimes want to believe those urban legends, and there have been times where I went online and people post that, and I say, well, no, here's the quote from his executioner. They don't believe it because they want to believe the urban legend. And it is more interesting, it is. That would have been amazing if he's sitting in an electric chair and it shorts out, kind of like the Green Mile or whatever. But no, it didn't affect it at all.
Wow. And so the letter he wrote to Grace Budd's mother was pretty, it was defining of how he killed her and what he did.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, Albert Fish, when, he was arrested first for kidnapping before they, found the girl's body, he said it wasn't kidnapping because the mother let me take her. Because, we have to look at the Depression, people were desperate. So he put an ad in the newspaper basically looking for a strong young man to help him on his farm. Well, he didn't have a farm. He was basically lying. He wanted to get a little boy. He was in the younger boys. So when he went to the Budds family's house in New York, he saw that this kid was the boy was kind of a big kid, and he wouldn't be able to handle him. So then he saw a little Grace Bud, and she looked kind of boyish to him. So, he said, well, you know what, let me come back again. I've got somewhere to go. And the first time he was there, he had a lot of cash. He flashed cash, and they all got excited. They thought, okay, he stuck to the story that he still wanted to hire the son, even though in his mind he knew he probably wouldn't be able to handle him if he took him, and he wouldn't be able to kill him. So he said, well, let me leave, and I'll come back. So he came back another day. And when he came back to visit them another day, supposedly to take the boy to his farm to help him, he created this story of his granddaughter or niece's birthday party on a certain intersection, and, well, why don't I take, your little daughter, Grace Bud, to go with? And it's just amazing that they let this man that the family met twice, a stranger basically, take their daughter, which they did, and they said, okay. But, later, when she didn't come home, now here are people, it's like you never know your city in reality, but when he told them the street intersection, later they thought about it and looked it up. Well, there was no street intersection with those numbers. It didn't exist. He just made it up in his head. Now, if they knew every street in New York, they'd be able to say, something's not right here. But still, I think it was the lure of, okay, this guy might be able to help out the family, and we may be able to get some money, from this. And they actually did let him take Grace Bud with him, and he described in the letter, remember, on this date, I showed up at your apartment, and you let me take Grace Bud. We had some cake. I told you that I was going to take her to a party. And he told the whole journey. And I took that journey when I was researching the case, because I found the actual house where he murdered Grace Bud in upstate New York. And, it took me, current times, when I made the film, it was released in 2007, so I probably shot that in 2005 or 6. But, it took me hours, 2 to 3 hours just to get up there. I had to take a train. Then, I had to take a cab. Then I had to walk down these country roads until I found that house. So imagine, this little girl going on this journey thinking, okay, she's going to a party. And then here, he's taking her on this long journey of hours. Then he gets her to this abandoned house, and she's outside. He describes it all in the letter, how she played with flowers, and he stripped naked. He called her in. She came in. He strangled her. And then that's when he cut pieces of her body and buried the rest in her head out and back of the house. And investigators, after his confession, they did go and find, her head, her skull, and parts of her body, because it was 6 years later.
Wow. And so do we really know how many people he killed overall, or it's typical we don't?
No, we don't. We only know for a fact Grace Bud. Possibly Billy Gaffney, that other little boy that he had taken out of the fire escape, which, he said he did at the end after when he was in prison, but we don't even know that. So, it could have been 2, it could have been dozens, it could have been hundreds, we don't know. We just have no idea. I mean, definitely he molested many children, but as far as killed, we have no idea, and he didn't confess to any others.
So what did he actually get convicted of?
He was convicted of the murder of Grace Bud.
Just the one murder, and he got
just the one,
and he got executed for that.
Yeah. A lot of times in these cases, just like the H.H. Holmes case, he was just tried for the murder of Benjamin Peitzel, who he did murder, but there were there was the murder of Peitzel's 3 children, which Holmes did as well, who he confessed to later, but not at the trial. But if he wasn't convicted of the murder of Benjamin Peitzel, they had the children's murders, which they could, pull out and deal with those. But usually when it's just the one murder, they're like, okay, at that time period, they said, okay, if we could get them on this, because that's where all the evidence is, They had, like Fish had, the letter, the confession letter that he wrote about Grace Bud. They found her body, or what was left of it. And with H.H. Holmes, it was Benjamin Peitzel. I mean, they did find the children's bodies as well, too. But, at the time, and when I published my book on Holmes, The Strange Case of Dr. H.H. Holmes, Holmes' own story in there was written just before the trial. So, of course, it's Holmes saying, oh, I was like an uncle to these children. I would never kill them. It's basically him trying to say he's innocent. But it's still an interesting read. Yeah,
very good one. Now, was Albert Fish married?
He was, but he never remarried after the first wife.
Oh, but was she living with him at the time he was doing all this?
No. And that's what he says. Once she divorced him, once she left him, that's when he said the door opened for him to do whatever he wanted to. And that's when he supposedly really ramped up the molestations and the murders. Because before that, he was just, while he was with his wife, he was just meeting women that he placed ads in for S&M play in newspapers, because that's how people would, find other like-minded people at the time. They would put ads in newspapers.
It's amazing. So, is there a theme to the stories you pick? I mean,
other than serial killers, not really. I'm really fascinated with serial killers that have a very strong psychological component, like the ones I've either created books on or produced films on. Albert Fish had a religious dementia. Ed Gein just slowly went insane, because of supposedly how his mother was overbearing to him. H.H. Holmes, although an evil genius, obviously, he could have became a Rockefeller or a Carnegie, but unfortunately, he went about it in evil ways. So, if there's a way that, like for instance, I'm currently writing now with Keith Jesperson. He's the happy face killer. He killed, I think it was 6 women in Oregon. And the only reason I'm writing him is because he's interested in having me do a documentary on his story. But, there are some components that are interesting, but on the whole, and I'm not saying the victims were unimportant. Of course they were, but, for a trucker or, someone like the Green River Killer to pick up prostitutes and murder them and throw them outside a road, to me, it isn't as interesting as, say, a cannibal or a vampire or, what are the reasons, the psychological reasons behind some of these more, devious and, fascinating serial killers' mindsets and the psychology. And, when I've studied them, I believe there's a lot of environmental factors, like Jeffrey Dahmer as well, that, it's either, it might not be abuse, it could be trauma, but, there were things that happened to them in the formative ages, definitely between like 7 and 12, that, it kind of formed them in the path they were going to go on for the rest of their life, or the things they were interested in.
Yeah, do you think anybody's really portrayed, let's say, H.H. Holmes properly in a movie? I mean, other than
No, I mean, there was my documentary, and there was several other documentaries. There's never been a feature film on H.H. Holmes. I think there was a film where he was sort of a supernatural spirit. I'm not sure, but the documentaries that I had seen, one was interesting. It was National Geographic, and it was a documentary, and it had Holmes riding a bicycle with a cape on. And I don't know where they got that from. I'm like, okay. He must have had a cape that I didn't know of, and he must have liked to ride bikes that I didn't know of. Anything for visuals. So, it's interesting now that, supposedly, again, the DiCaprio movie is going on, but, I'm anxiously, optimistic, just because Tom Cruise had the rights at first. They lapsed to the book Devil in the White City. Then DiCaprio bought the rights after that. Years ago it was said that he was doing the film. Now the latest news last August was that Martin Scorsese is going to direct. But again, we haven't heard anything since then, and that was August. So is it going to happen? It might not. And these things fall apart all the time in Hollywood. I love it because I heard they're even going to fictionalize it, possibly, making it in the film version where Holmes worked with Burnham, or they worked together. Burnham was the architect of the World's Fair, and of course Holmes was the architect of his murder hotel. So, in a way I hope they fictionalize it, because that way I could give lectures about the true story. Yeah.
Did you like the way American Horror Story sort of did it?
Yeah, that was interesting. And what was also interesting, that when Kathy Bates was describing it, she read an exact line from my documentary that Harold Schechter said, that the rooms were soundproof with asbestos, It's the exact line from my film. And of course I know every line by rote, so I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool that they did it in black and white, and a little nod to Holmes in my movie. I'm like, oh, it's kind of cool,
Yeah, I think by far it's the best thing out there now for that, for a drama, sort of. But maybe maybe they'll end up doing a movie with Scorsese. You never know.
Yeah, that would be great. And because, with Scorsese, I don't think he would hold back on the violence. And I think for this, you would need to see a little of that, because obviously it is important. And, he's a master filmmaker. I mean, he's one of my favorites. So it is in good hands if it actually goes through. So, like I said, I would still love to do a definitive Ed Gein movie sometime in the future. If I could, raise enough money, I think that would be great.
How many serial killers do you think are around right now, alive?
Oh, man, they always say there's at least, I think now they're saying there's always at least 50 maybe, but, I definitely know the Long Island serial killer. They haven't, caught them yet, and I think there was another one in Ohio. So, I don't know if the news is becoming, more savvy and not covering some of the smaller stories, or waiting for another like Dahmer kind of incident. But, that they've always been the subject of people's scorn because they say, well, every time something happens, you put it on the news and people become interested, and that's why they've created these serial killers as celebrities, But I think people are always going to be interested in, things that are different and unusual and macabre that they don't see every day, and, it's turned into, we have these, death metal bands like Macabre. They do songs on these serial killers. And, and in my fourth film, Serial Killer Culture, I interviewed some of the people, artists, and, collectors that are involved in the serial killer culture that, I call it, and why they're interested in it. And it always comes down to a fascination that people read about these cases and they either want to create art on it, or some people want to collect their things, whether it was their autograph or something they owned, or their underwear or hair or fingernail clippings, and it still goes on nowadays. There's a big business on it. Murder Auction, is a site that has, lists hundreds or thousands of items that you could buy, whether it's artwork or, pieces of, their own body.
Yeah, it always makes me wonder, but, and people like Charles Manson getting married, and how do people why are we so obsessed with this? Like, I don't get that.
Yeah, I think it's the fact that it's, something we don't experience every day. And, even now they've almost become these folk tales, even though they were true. And when the younger people now are hearing about it, they're fascinated by it and they want to research it. And, we've always been interested in that as a society all over the world. Jack the Ripper, when that occurred, people were taking, parts of where the crimes occurred at, whether it was bricks or stones from the locations, when murderers were hanged in the old days, in the Old West, they would take parts of the rope, that, had hung them. And, I think we'll always be fascinated with serial killers and crime and murder because it's just something we don't experience on a day-to-day basis. Well, being in Chicago, we experience it a lot here now, but it's a different story. Holmes's neighborhood his neighborhood now is filled with murder, just not the calculating type that, he was.
Yeah, totally. I also hear that female serial killers are on the rise.
Yes. There's a great book, Female Serial Killers by Peter Borowski, where he talks about, we don't hear a lot about female serial killers, but they're out there. But, many times females, they'll do it, much more quickly and much more clean than a male might do it. So, it might happen quicker. You may not hear about it, but they're definitely out there, and that's a subject I like to explore too, minority and female serial killers, because they're out there. The first, one of the first black serial killers, not the first, but the one that was termed, serial killer from was, basically in the 70s, and that's, who the FBI interrogated.
Yeah. And female serial killers tend to know their victims more than the males.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yes. Yeah. That's usually the difference with females, and, we all know about Eileen Wuornos, but as you go back in time, there was another one called Belle Guinness, and she was very much like an H.H. Holmes, and she wound up disappearing. They never found out what happened to her, but she would marry men and then, obviously wealthy men, and then, kill them and take their money and then leave somewhere else. But she operated, I think, in Indiana.
Right. Who are your biggest influences then?
Mine are, it's Hitchcock, Scorsese, Spielberg. I like films and filmmakers that are crafted technically, that, are well thought out. That's why I'm not into a lot of the current mode of movie making when it's all handheld, because, I've studied editing technique and, shot composition. So when I see those elements in films now, but especially in the past, I think the 70s was kind of the epitome, the peak of filmmaking, because it pushed, not only did it push boundaries, but it introduced us to so many other filmmakers that, for once the camera wasn't huge and bulky like in the old days where you'd have to, keep it set in one position. They were able to, do different types of movements and different angles, Roman Polanski, filmmakers like that where, they use technical expertise when they're filming and editing to create the story, to create a certain effect on the audience. Because I think all art, has an effect, and that's to create an emotion in the viewer. And I think if it hasn't achieved its potential, whether it's, to make them laugh or cry or be scared, and those are the filmmakers and films that I really like.
So now, where do people find your films and your information?
The best hub to find everything is my site, johnborowski.com, but I think if you type in Google serial killer documentaries or filmmaker, I think my name's at the top, or you could just type in the names of these serial killers. Right now there are several films on Netflix. Carl Panzram was the subject of my third film. That's on Netflix. H.H. Holmes is on Netflix. Some are on Hulu, iTunes. They're all on Amazon available, even though now I think Amazon is transitioning to open the door for films to be viewed in like the UK and Germany and some other countries, so that's good. So I don't know if they're available now. They may be offline for a week or two until they do that process, but they're pretty much all out there. If you type the name of the killer in the film or type a book or whatever, my stuff will come up.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for talking about things, and the new book, Ed Gein File. Hope to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Anytime, when you want to talk about horror films, serial killers, or, just movies in general, I'll do more than that.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
I'll be back.